The dog wouldn't move. For 3 days, the massive Belgian Malinois had planted himself at the entrance of the collapsed barn, refusing food, refusing water, refusing every command. His amber eyes were fixed on something inside the wreckage that no one else could see. The hospice nurse had tried to coax him away. The neighbors had tried. Even the animal control officer had given up after the dog's low, warning growl made it clear he wasn't going anywhere. Inside the small farmhouse 20 yards away, the dog's owner lay dying, and everyone assumed the animal had simply gone mad with grief. They were wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What the dog was guarding in that ruined barn wasn't a memory. It was a miracle. And in 72 hours, it would be the only thing standing between a decorated war hero and a silent, lonely death. The house sat at the end of a gravel road that hadn't seen fresh stone in a decade, nestled in the rolling farmland of rural Kentucky where the autumn corn stood brown and brittle in fields that stretched to touch the horizon. It was a modest single-story structure with white paint that had weathered to gray, a sagging front porch, and a brick chimney that leaked smoke on cold mornings. The property had once been a working farm, 15 acres of decent soil that had supported 3 generations of the Patterson family. Now it was just the house, a detached garage with a roof that needed replacing, and the old dairy barn that had finally surrendered to gravity and time during a thunderstorm 2 months prior. Thomas Patterson had bought the place in 2019 after his second divorce, paying cash with money he'd saved from 22 years in the Army. He was 53 years old then, lean and weathered, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of quiet intensity that made people instinctively step back when they met him. He had served in places whose names he couldn't share doing work he couldn't discuss, and he had the scars both visible and invisible to prove it. The farm was supposed to be his retirement, his reward for a life spent in service to a country that had used him up and sent him home with a handshake, a modest pension, and a collection of pills for conditions that had no cure. The cancer had announced itself 14 months after he'd moved in. It started as a persistent cough he'd attributed to the dust from renovating the old farmhouse. Then came the weight loss, the night sweats, and finally the visit to the VA hospital in Louisville that ended with a diagnosis delivered by a young oncologist who couldn't quite meet his eyes. Stage 4 lung cancer, metastasized to the lymph nodes and liver. The doctor had used words like aggressive and advanced and limited options. Thomas had sat in the sterile examination room, nodding at the appropriate moments, his face betraying nothing. He'd been in worse situations. At least this enemy had the decency to be straightforward about its intentions. He'd declined the aggressive treatment protocols. The chemotherapy might buy him a few extra months, the doctors said, but the quality of those months would be poor. Thomas had seen enough suffering in his life. He'd held dying men in his arms in desert compounds and jungle clearings, watched the light leave their eyes while he whispered lies about how help was coming. He wasn't afraid of death. He was only afraid of dying badly, of losing himself piece by piece to pain and medication until he became a burden to the few people who still cared whether he drew breath. So he'd chosen hospice. Palliative care only. He would die at home, on his own terms, with whatever dignity a man could salvage from such an undignified process. The hospice agency had been professional and kind. They'd set up a hospital bed in what had been the living room, positioned so Thomas could see out the large front window across his land. A nurse named Rebecca came 3 times a week to check his vitals, adjust his medication, and ask gentle questions about his pain levels and his wishes. She was in her 40s, competent and warm without being cloying, and she treated him like a person rather than a diagnosis. She never pressed him to talk about his feelings or his regrets, which he appreciated. Some things were meant to be carried to the grave. His nearest neighbor was a widow named Dorothy Chen who lived a quarter-mile down the road in a tidy ranch house with a garden that could have graced a magazine cover. She was 71, sharp as a tack, and had appointed herself Thomas's unofficial guardian the moment word of his illness spread through the small community. She brought him meals he rarely ate, sat with him when the loneliness became too heavy, and asked for nothing in return except that he let her help. Thomas, who had spent his adult life trusting no one and needing nothing, found himself actually looking forward to her visits. She had a dry sense of humor and a gift for knowing when to talk and when to simply sit in companionable silence. But his truest companion, his most loyal friend, was the dog. Atlas was a Belgian Malinois, 4 years old, 75 pounds of muscle and intelligence and unwavering devotion. Thomas had adopted him from a military working dog rescue organization 2 years earlier. Atlas had washed out of the K9 program not for lack of ability but for an excess of it. He was too intelligent, too independent, too willing to make his own tactical decisions rather than blindly following commands. In a military context, that made him unreliable. In civilian life, it made him extraordinary. From the moment Thomas had brought him home, they'd understood each other with the wordless clarity of soldiers who'd both served and both been deemed no longer useful. Thomas had trained him using hand signals rather than voice commands, hours of patient repetition until they could communicate across a field with nothing but a gesture. They ran together in the early mornings before the cancer had stolen Thomas's strength. They sat together in the evenings, Atlas's heavy head resting on Thomas's knee while he read or simply stared into the middle distance, remembering things he wished he could forget. The dog had known something was wrong before the diagnosis. Animals always knew. Atlas had become more attentive, more protective, pressing close to Thomas's side and watching him with those unsettling amber eyes that seemed to see straight through flesh and bone to the sickness growing inside. When Thomas had returned from that first oncology appointment, Atlas had met him at the door and simply leaned his full weight against his legs, offering the only comfort he knew how to give. Now, as autumn deepened and Thomas's condition deteriorated, Atlas had become his shadow. The dog slept on the floor beside the hospital bed, his breathing synchronized with his master's labored inhalations. He followed Thomas on his increasingly infrequent walks from the bedroom to the bathroom and back. He ate little, as if fasting in solidarity with the man who could barely keep down broth and crackers. Rebecca the nurse had commented more than once that she'd never seen such devotion from an animal. Dorothy had quietly started leaving extra food for Atlas, worried that the dog would starve himself out of grief. The barn had collapsed on a Tuesday night in late August during a storm that had rolled in from the west with the fury of something personal. Thomas had been awake, as he often was, the pain in his bones making sleep a rare and precious commodity. He'd heard the groaning of old timber, the shriek of nails pulling free from wood, and then the thunderous crash as the entire structure folded in on itself like a house of cards. In the morning, he'd surveyed the damage from his window. What had once been a proud if dilapidated barn was now a heap of splintered boards, twisted metal roofing, and broken dreams. He'd felt a strange kinship with it. They were both collapsing under the weight of their years, surrendering to forces they could no longer resist. He'd called Dorothy to let her know, and she'd immediately started making arrangements to have it cleared away. The wreckage was an eyesore and potentially dangerous, she'd argued. What if some kid wandered onto the property and got hurt? But Thomas had waved her off. It didn't matter, he'd said. Nothing mattered except making it to the end with some shred of himself intact. Let the barn rot. Let the whole damn farm go back to weeds. He wouldn't be around to see it. Atlas, curiously, had been fascinated by the ruins. In the days following the collapse, the dog had spent hours nosing through the debris, his tail high, his body language alert and purposeful. Thomas had watched from the window, mildly curious but too exhausted to investigate. Probably hunting rats, he'd thought. The barn had been full of them when it was standing. Now they'd be scattered and disoriented, easy prey for a dog with Atlas's drive. But 3 days ago, everything had changed. Thomas had woken from a fitful sleep to find Atlas gone from his usual post beside the bed. He'd called for him, his voice weak and raspy. Nothing. He'd managed to lever himself upright, waves of nausea and dizziness washing over him, and made his way to the window. Atlas was sitting at the edge of the barn wreckage, perfectly still, staring into the jumbled mass of wood and metal with an intensity that was almost unnerving. Thomas had called again. Atlas's ears had swiveled toward the sound, acknowledging that he'd heard, but he hadn't moved. Hadn't even turned his head. For a dog who had been trained to respond to the subtlest commands, this was unprecedented. Thomas had felt a flutter of concern. Was the dog sick? Injured? He'd shuffled to the front door, opened it, and called once more. Atlas had finally looked at him then, and Thomas had seen something in those amber eyes he'd never seen before. Not defiance. Not confusion. Something closer to urgency. The dog had barked once, a sharp commanding sound, then turned back to the barn. Rebecca had arrived for her scheduled visit an hour later and found Thomas sitting on the porch steps in his bathrobe, exhausted from the effort of getting outside, staring at his dog who was staring at a pile of rubble. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She tried to help Thomas back inside, clucking her tongue at his recklessness, but he'd refused to move until she agreed to go see what was wrong with Atlas. She'd walked across the yard, calling to the dog in her cheerful professional voice, but Atlas had ignored her completely. When she'd gotten close enough to touch him, he'd turned and growled, low and serious. Rebecca had backed away immediately, her hands raised in surrender. Dorothy had been summoned. She'd arrived with a bag of Atlas's favorite treats, certain she could coax him away from whatever had captured his attention. The dog had refused the treats. Refused her touch. Refused everything except his self-appointed vigil at the barn. When she tried to physically pull him away by his collar, he'd planted his feet and growled with such menace that she'd let go and stumbled backward, genuinely frightened. Dorothy, who'd raised 3 children and intimidated 2 husbands, was not easily rattled. But there was something in the dog's eyes that told her he would bite if pressed further, and not out of meanness but out of desperate necessity. Animal control had been the next logical step. Officer Martinez had shown up in his truck with a catch pole and a tranquilizer gun, prepared to remove what he'd been told was a dangerous animal. But when he'd assessed the situation, he'd hesitated. The dog wasn't aggressive in the traditional sense. He wasn't foaming at the mouth or lunging at people. He was simply guarding something, his body language clear and purposeful. Martinez had approached slowly, talking in soothing tones, but Atlas had made his position clear with that same low warning growl. The officer had stood there for a long moment, studying the dog, then shaken his head. He'd walked back to where Thomas sat on the porch, now wrapped in a blanket Dorothy had brought, shivering despite the mild temperature. Martinez had removed his cap and run a hand through his thinning hair. He'd seen a lot of strange animal behavior in his 15 years on the job, he'd told Thomas, but this was different. The dog wasn't rabid or crazy. He was trying to tell them something. Martinez's recommendation had been to leave Atlas alone for now, keep an eye on the situation, and call if the dog became truly aggressive or tried to leave the property. Then he'd driven away, leaving them all to puzzle over what could possibly compel such a well-trained animal to mutiny against everything he'd been taught. That had been 3 days ago. For 72 hours, Atlas had maintained his vigil. He hadn't eaten. He'd barely moved except to shift his position slightly or to lift his head when someone approached. His water bowl, placed near him by Dorothy, sat untouched. His coat, normally sleek and glossy, was beginning to look dull. His body, powerfully built and athletic, was starting to show the first signs of weight loss. He was dying by degrees, standing guard over something that no one else could see or understand. Thomas had watched it all from his window, too weak now to even make it to the porch. His own condition had accelerated in the past few days, as if his body had decided that it too had had enough of waiting. The pain was a constant companion now, dulled only slightly by the morphine Rebecca administered with increasing frequency. His breathing was labored, each inhalation a conscious effort. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor that made Dorothy look away when she sat with him. He was entering the final stage, Rebecca had told him gently. Days, maybe a week at most. It was time to think about saying his goodbyes, about making peace with whatever needed settling. But Thomas couldn't make peace with this. He couldn't die knowing that his dog, his faithful companion, his only real friend in this world, was starving himself to death over a pile of rubble for reasons no one could fathom. It gnawed at him worse than the cancer, this mystery. Atlas was trying to tell them something. Thomas knew it with the same certainty he'd once known when an operation was about to go sideways, when the enemy was closer than the intelligence suggested, when trusting his gut meant the difference between coming home and being shipped home in a box. Dorothy sat beside his bed now, her hand resting lightly on his forearm, careful not to press too hard against skin that bruised at the slightest touch. She'd been talking, her voice a soothing murmur about her grandson's upcoming wedding, about the recipe she was perfecting for Thanksgiving even though Thomas wouldn't be there to taste it. She talked to fill the silence, to give him something to focus on besides the pain and the sound of his own failing body. But Thomas wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on the window, on the distant shape of Atlas, still and watchful. Rebecca arrived for the evening medication round, her footsteps soft on the worn carpet. She took his vitals with practiced efficiency, her face carefully neutral as she noted the numbers that told their grim story. Blood pressure dropping. Oxygen saturation declining. Heart rate irregular. She adjusted the morphine drip, increasing the dosage slightly, and asked him the questions she was required to ask. Was he comfortable? Did he need anything? Were there any calls he wanted her to make, any people he wanted to see? Thomas shook his head to all of it. There was no one to call. His parents were long dead. His siblings, if they were still alive, had drifted away decades ago, the bonds of family severed by distance and indifference and his own inability to maintain connections. His ex-wives had moved on to other lives, other husbands, and wouldn't welcome a call from a dying man seeking absolution for failures he couldn't even articulate. His army buddies, the few who'd survived, were scattered across the country, and most of them were fighting their own battles with the VA, with addiction, with the weight of memories that never got lighter. He'd lived a solitary life by choice and by circumstance, and he'd told himself he preferred it that way. No attachments meant no vulnerabilities. No loved ones meant no one to lose. It was a philosophy that had served him well in war zones where caring too much about your brothers in arms could paralyze you when they fell. But now, at the end, it meant dying alone except for a paid nurse and a kind neighbor and a dog who was choosing to join him in death for reasons Thomas couldn't begin to understand. Night fell, and Dorothy reluctantly left to tend to her own home, promising to return first thing in the morning. Rebecca stayed longer than her shift required, sitting quietly in the corner with her paperwork, unwilling to leave him completely alone. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness, the morphine pulling him under into dreams that were more like memories, fragmented and intense. He was back in Afghanistan, the air hot and dry and filled with dust that coated his throat. He was crouched behind a crumbling wall, his radio crackling with urgent voices, coordinates and call signs and desperate requests for support. He was watching a convoy burn on a mountain road, black smoke rising into an impossibly blue sky. He was holding a young soldier's hand, a kid from Iowa who kept asking for his mother, and Thomas was lying, telling him the medevac was almost there, that he was going to be fine, knowing with absolute certainty that the boy would be dead before the helicopter arrived. He woke with a gasp, his heart hammering against his ribs, Rebecca's face hovering over his with concern. She pressed a cool cloth to his forehead and murmured something soothing, and gradually his breathing slowed. The morphine pulled him back down, but this time into a deeper, quieter place where the memories couldn't follow. When he surfaced again, it was early morning. Pale gray light filtered through the window. Rebecca was asleep in the chair, her head tilted at an uncomfortable angle. And outside, Atlas still stood as vigil, a dark sentinel against the dawn. Thomas lay there, watching the light strengthen and spread across his land. The corn in the distant field rustled in a breeze he couldn't feel. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals he couldn't see. It was beautiful in a stark, lonely way, this place he'd chosen to die. He'd thought it would be enough, this quiet ending in a place that was his own. But he'd been wrong. The loneliness wasn't peaceful. It was crushing. It was a weight on his chest heavier than the cancer, squeezing out what little breath he had left. He thought about Atlas, about the fierce loyalty that had driven the dog to abandon everything, food and water and comfort, to guard something in that ruined barn. What kind of love was that? What kind of devotion? Thomas had spent his life believing he didn't deserve such things, that he was fundamentally unworthy of the kind of connection that demanded sacrifice. He'd built walls around himself so high and so thick that no one could scale them, and he'd congratulated himself on his strength, his independence, his refusal to need anyone. But watching his dog choose to die rather than abandon his post, Thomas understood with sudden painful clarity that he'd been wrong about everything. Strength wasn't isolation. Independence wasn't the same as freedom. And refusing to need anyone didn't make you strong. It just made you alone. Atlas, with his stubborn vigil and his mysterious purpose, was showing him something essential about loyalty and love that Thomas had spent 54 years running from. He had to know. Before he died, before he took his last breath in this bed surrounded by medical equipment and the smell of sickness, he had to know what Atlas was guarding. Even if it killed him to find out. Even if the effort of getting there used up what little time he had left. He couldn't leave this world without understanding why his dog was willing to leave it too. Rebecca stirred in her chair, blinking awake with a start. She looked immediately to Thomas, her professional instincts kicking in, checking to see if he was still breathing, still present. Their eyes met, and she saw something there that made her straighten up. He needed to go outside, he told her. His voice was barely a whisper, rasping through a throat raw from disuse. He needed to see what Atlas was guarding. She tried to talk him out of it, listing all the reasons it was a terrible idea. He was too weak. The pain would be unbearable. The exertion could kill him. He was on palliative care, she reminded him gently. The goal now was comfort, not heroics. But Thomas was unmoved. He'd made worse decisions under worse conditions and survived. One more bad decision wouldn't change the outcome. He was dying anyway. At least let him die knowing, let him die having tried one last time to understand the only creature in this world who'd shown him unconditional love. Rebecca looked at him for a long moment, and he saw the exact instant she made her decision. She was a hospice nurse. Her job was to ease suffering and honor wishes. If this was his wish, she would help him. She called Dorothy, explaining the situation in hushed tones. Within 20 minutes, Dorothy was there with her grandson Kevin, a strapping young man in his 20s who worked construction. Between the three of them, they managed to get Thomas into a wheelchair Dorothy had borrowed from the church. Every movement was agony. Lifting him from the bed, settling him into the chair, wrapping him in blankets against the morning chill, each step extracted a price in pain that made his vision white out at the edges. But he endured it, his jaw clenched, his breathing shallow and quick. They wheeled him out onto the porch, and the fresh air hit him like a slap. He'd been inside for so long that he'd forgotten what the world smelled like. Earth and grass and the faint sweetness of dying leaves. Kevin maneuvered the wheelchair down the ramp he'd built months ago when it became clear Thomas wouldn't be walking much longer, and they started across the yard toward the barn. The ground was uneven, and every bump sent jolts of pain through his body, but Thomas kept his eyes fixed on Atlas. The dog had turned at the sound of the wheelchair, his ears pricked forward. For a moment, Thomas thought he might run to him, might break his vigil to greet his master. But Atlas stayed where he was, his body tense, his gaze shifting between Thomas and whatever he was guarding. As they got closer, Thomas could see how much the dog had deteriorated. His ribs were beginning to show. His eyes were sunken. He looked like a ghost of himself, held upright only by sheer force of will. They stopped about 10 feet away, close enough to see but not so close as to provoke another warning. Thomas stared at the wreckage of the barn, trying to see what Atlas saw, trying to understand what could be worth dying for. It just looked like debris to him. Broken boards weathered gray by decades of Kentucky weather. Sheets of corrugated metal twisted into abstract sculptures. The remnants of stalls where dairy cows had once stood. Nothing special. Nothing worth a life, human or canine. But Atlas was staring at a specific spot, his gaze never wavering. Thomas followed the line of sight, squinting against the morning sun. There, toward the back of the collapsed structure where the old hayloft had been, something was different. The rubble seemed less settled somehow, as if something underneath was disturbing it. And then Thomas saw it. Movement. Just a flicker, barely perceptible. but movement nonetheless. His heart, weak and irregular, stuttered in his chest. Something was alive in there. Something was trapped in the wreckage, and Atlas had known it from the beginning. That was what he'd been guarding. That was why he'd refused to leave, refused to eat, refused every command and every kindness. He was standing watch over something that couldn't save itself. Thomas looked at Kevin, at Rebecca, at Dorothy. They'd all seen it too, that telltale movement in the debris. For a moment, they all stood frozen, unsure what to do. Then Thomas spoke, his voice carrying a note of command that hadn't been there in months. They needed to get it out, he said. Whatever was in there, they needed to save it. Now. Kevin didn't hesitate. He was young and strong and still believed in the fundamental goodness of effort. He waded into the debris, careful of his footing, pulling aside boards and sheets of metal with his work-gloved hands. Rebecca called out warnings about nails and splinters and the structural instability of the pile. Dorothy stood beside Thomas's wheelchair, her hand on his shoulder, both of them watching as the young man dug deeper into the wreckage. Atlas had moved closer, his body quivering with an emotion that looked almost like hope. He whined, a high anxious sound completely unlike his usual stoic silence, and paced back and forth at the edge of the debris pile, wanting to help but unable to do so. Kevin was making progress, creating a gap in the rubble, pulling away layer after layer of the barn's corpse. And then he stopped, his body going completely still. He'd found it. Whatever Atlas had been guarding, Kevin was staring at it, and his face had gone pale. He turned back to the others, and his voice when he spoke was shaking. They needed to call someone, he said. They needed to call for help right now. Not animal control. Not the fire department. The police. They needed to call the police immediately. Thomas felt a cold dread settle into his stomach, mixing with the morphine and the pain and the exhaustion. What had Atlas found? What had been buried in the barn all this time, hidden and waiting? Kevin's reaction suggested something terrible, something criminal. Had someone dumped a body here? Had his property been used for some dark purpose without his knowledge? But even as these thoughts raced through his mind, Atlas gave another whine and pushed past Kevin into the gap he'd created. The dog disappeared into the wreckage, and they could hear him moving around, the scrape of his claws on wood, the sound of his breathing in the enclosed space. And then a new sound. A sound that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat and his eyes suddenly burn with tears he didn't know he still had the strength to cry. A voice. Small and weak and terrified. A child's voice, calling out from beneath the ruins of the barn. Calling for help in a language Thomas didn't understand but recognized all the same. It was the universal language of fear, of pain, of desperate hope that someone, anyone, would hear and would care enough to answer. Dorothy was the one who made the call, her fingers trembling as she dialed 911 on her cell phone. Her voice was steady though, a lifetime of handling crises as a mother and grandmother kicking in even as her mind struggled to process what Kevin had just told them. She spoke in clear, measured sentences. They had found a child. A young child, alive but trapped beneath the collapsed barn at the Patterson property. They needed emergency services immediately. Police, fire department, paramedics. Everything they could send. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone, professional but urgent, asking questions Dorothy couldn't answer. How old was the child? Male or female? What were the injuries? How long had they been trapped? Dorothy looked helplessly at Kevin, who was still standing at the edge of the debris pile, his face white as chalk. He shook his head. He didn't know. He could barely see anything in the darkness beneath the boards. Just a glimpse of small hands, dirty and scraped. Just the sound of that terrified voice speaking words he couldn't understand. Thomas sat in his wheelchair, his body forgotten in the overwhelming urgency of the moment. The pain that had been his constant companion receded to a distant throb as adrenaline flooded his system, giving him a temporary reprieve. His mind, sharpened by years of emergency response training, was already working through the tactical situation. A trapped victim in unstable rubble. Unknown duration of entrapment. Possible injuries including crush trauma, dehydration, hypothermia. Time was critical. Every minute mattered. Atlas had not emerged from the gap in the debris. They could hear him in there, whining and moving around, and occasionally the child's voice would rise in pitch, words tumbling over each other too fast to distinguish individual sounds. The dog was doing something, Thomas realized. He was keeping the child calm, or trying to. He was providing the comfort and presence that Kevin's brief appearance and subsequent retreat had promised and then withdrawn. Rebecca had moved into action with the swift efficiency of someone who'd spent her career dealing with medical emergencies. She was kneeling at the edge of the debris pile, calling into the darkness in the most soothing voice she could muster. She was telling the child that help was coming, that they were going to be okay, that they just needed to stay calm and stay still. She had no idea if the child understood English, but tone was universal. Fear could hear kindness in any language. The response time for emergency services in rural Kentucky was not measured in minutes but in fractions of hours. The nearest fire station was in the town of Millbrook, 15 miles away on roads that twisted through the hills like ribbons draped over crumpled paper. The sheriff's department was even farther. But Dorothy's call had been flagged as a priority emergency, and within 12 minutes they heard the first sirens in the distance, that distinctive wail that meant help was coming, that the cavalry was on its way. Sheriff Ray Coleman arrived first in his cruiser, lights flashing, gravel spraying as he brought the vehicle to a sliding stop in Thomas's driveway. Coleman was a man in his late 50s, built like a barrel, with a face weathered by sun and responsibility. He'd been sheriff of Madison County for 23 years, and in that time he'd seen his share of strange calls, but this one had his gut churning with dread. A trapped child was every first responder's nightmare. The window for survival was narrow, and the margin for error was non-existent. He approached at a run, his duty belt jangling, his boots pounding across the yard. Dorothy met him halfway and gave him the situation in rapid sentences. Coleman listened, nodded, and immediately radioed for additional resources. He needed the technical rescue team from Louisville. He needed the state police. He needed every pair of hands and every piece of equipment they could mobilize. Then he moved to the debris pile, assessing it with the eye of someone who'd seen buildings collapse and knew the treacherous physics of weight and balance. Kevin was explaining what he'd seen and heard, his words tumbling over each other in his urgency to communicate. Coleman held up a hand, slowing him down, making him repeat the critical details. Where exactly had he seen the child? How stable was the rubble around that point? Was there active shifting or creaking that suggested imminent secondary collapse? Kevin answered as best he could, but the truth was he didn't know. He'd moved a few boards, seen movement, heard the voice, and backed away for fear of making things worse. The fire department arrived next, 2 trucks and 8 firefighters led by Chief Marcus Webb, a compact man with silver hair and the kind of calm demeanor that came from 30 years of walking into burning buildings. Webb conferred briefly with Coleman, then began organizing his crew. They needed to stabilize the debris field before they could attempt an extraction. They needed to create a safe access point. And they needed to do it without causing a shift that could crush the child they were trying to save. Thomas watched it all from his wheelchair, 20 feet away from the organized chaos. Rebecca stood beside him, one hand on his shoulder, monitoring his breathing and his color with professional concern. He was gray-faced and sweating despite the cool morning air, his body trembling with the effort of simply remaining upright. She'd offered twice to take him back inside, and twice he'd refused with a shake of his head that allowed no argument. He would see this through. Whatever it cost him, he would be here until they brought that child out. Atlas finally emerged from the debris, backing out carefully, his body covered in dust and cobwebs. He looked exhausted, his legs shaking, but his eyes were clear and focused. He trotted directly to Thomas, pressing his body against the wheelchair, and for the first time in 3 days the dog seemed to relax slightly. He'd done his job. He'd kept watch until the humans understood. Now they would do what humans did best, bring their tools and their training and their stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Chief Webb approached Thomas, crouching down to bring himself to eye level with the man in the wheelchair. He needed to know about the barn's original structure, he explained. Load-bearing walls, the placement of support posts, the type of foundation. Anything that could help them understand what they were dealing with beneath all that wreckage. Thomas closed his eyes, reaching back through the fog of morphine and illness to remember. The barn had been built in 1947, he said slowly. Post and beam construction with a concrete foundation. The main support posts were 8x8 timbers, 6 of them in 2 rows. The hayloft floor had been 2-inch oak planks. The roof trusses were hand-hewn beams that probably weighed 300 pounds each. Webb listened intently, filing away every detail. The fact that there were substantial timber supports was good. They could create pockets of survivable space even under tremendous weight. The concrete foundation was also good. It provided a solid floor that wouldn't give way. But the weight of the roof, the hayloft floor, and all that timber was bad. If any of it had come down directly on the child, survival was unlikely. They were, Webb knew, potentially recovering a body rather than saving a life. But he didn't say that out loud. He thanked Thomas for the information, squeezed his shoulder gently, and returned to his crew. They'd brought specialized equipment, hydraulic lifting bags that could be inserted into small spaces and inflated to move tremendous weight. They had cutting tools and prying bars and enough experience to know that patience was more important than speed. Rushing could kill. Methodical, careful work might save. The state police arrived with 2 troopers who immediately began securing the scene and documenting everything for what would inevitably be an investigation. Where had this child come from? How long had they been here? This was now potentially a crime scene, and every piece of evidence needed to be preserved. The younger trooper, a woman named Santos, began taking statements. She spoke with Kevin first, writing down his account in precise shorthand. Then she moved to Dorothy, to Rebecca, and finally to Thomas. He told her what he knew, which was almost nothing. The barn had collapsed 2 months ago during a storm. He'd been too sick to deal with it. No one had been near it as far as he knew. He hadn't heard anything, hadn't seen anything. Until 3 days ago when Atlas had started his vigil, there'd been no indication that anything was wrong. Santos wrote it all down, her face carefully neutral, but Thomas could see the questions in her eyes. How could a child be trapped for 2 months and survive? It was impossible. The human body couldn't endure that long without water. Which meant either the child had gotten there more recently, or they were about to discover something far more terrible than anyone wanted to contemplate. The technical rescue team from Louisville arrived 90 minutes after the initial call, a convoy of specialized vehicles carrying equipment most people never saw outside of disaster footage on the evening news. The team leader was a woman named Captain Sarachan, small and wiry with the kind of intensity that came from knowing your decisions determined whether people lived or died. She'd worked earthquake rescues in Haiti, building collapses in Detroit, and tornado aftermath in Oklahoma. A barn collapse in rural Kentucky was well within her skill set, but that didn't make it routine. Every rescue was unique, every victim precious. Chen took command of the scene with quiet authority, coordinating between the fire department, the sheriff's office, and her own team. They established a safety perimeter, cleared unnecessary personnel, and began the painstaking process of debris removal. Every board was photographed before being moved. Every piece of metal was carefully extracted and set aside. They worked from the outside in, creating stable pathways and reducing the overall weight load before they got anywhere near the victim. One of Chen's team members was a paramedic named David Park who specialized in confined space medicine. He approached the gap where Kevin had first made contact and called into the darkness. He spoke slowly and clearly, introducing himself, explaining that he was there to help. The response came quickly, that same frightened voice speaking in rapid bursts. Park listened carefully, trying to identify the language. Not Spanish. Not any Asian language he recognized. The cadence and sounds were different. He looked back at Chen and shook his head. He'd need a translator, and he had no idea what language they were dealing with. Sheriff Coleman had already thought of that. He was on his radio coordinating with the county's emergency services to locate interpreters. The problem was that rural Kentucky wasn't exactly a melting pot of linguistic diversity. They had Spanish translators readily available, a few people who spoke various Asian languages in the larger towns, but beyond that they were working blind. He put out a request to the state police to access their database of certified interpreters, explaining the urgency. A child's life might depend on their ability to communicate. While they waited, Park was doing what he could through the gap. He'd inserted a small LED flashlight on an extendable rod, trying to see what they were dealing with. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dust motes and spider webs and the chaotic jumble of broken wood. He moved the light slowly, methodically, and then he saw it. A flash of fabric. Blue fabric, small and dirty. He adjusted the angle, and suddenly he could see a child's face, pale and streaked with dirt, eyes squinting against the sudden light. A girl, he thought, though it was hard to tell through the grime. Maybe 6 or 7 years old. East Asian features. Chinese or Korean, possibly Vietnamese. She was partially pinned beneath a large beam, he reported to Chen. The beam was resting on other debris, creating a small void space around her. She had freedom of movement in her upper body, could move her arms and turn her head. Her lower body was obscured, and he couldn't tell if she was pinned or simply wedged. She was conscious and alert, which was a very good sign. She was also clearly terrified, which was entirely understandable. Chen processed the information quickly. The good news was they had a live victim with a patent airway and sufficient space to breathe. The bad news was any attempt to move the beam could collapse the void space and crush her. They needed to stabilize everything around her before they could extract her. And they needed to do it while keeping her calm, which was going to be nearly impossible if they couldn't communicate. The interpreter arrived 45 minutes later, a graduate student from the University of Louisville named Min-Jun Lee who spoke Korean, Mandarin, and Cantonese. He'd been in class when he got the emergency call from the state police, and he'd driven like a madman to get here, his heart pounding with the weight of responsibility. He was 24 years old, and he'd never done anything like this. His language skills had been tested in classrooms and study abroad programs, not in life-or-death situations with terrified children trapped under buildings. Chen brought him directly to the gap in the debris and explained what they needed. She needed him to establish communication with the child. Find out her name, how long she'd been there, if she was injured, if she could move her legs. Keep her calm and let her know they were going to get her out. Min-Jun nodded, swallowed hard, and knelt down by the opening. He called out in Mandarin first, the most common Chinese dialect. No response beyond a frightened whimper. He tried Cantonese. Same result. Finally he tried Korean, and the effect was immediate. The child's voice rose in pitch and volume, words tumbling out in a desperate flood. Min-Jun listened, his face growing more troubled with every sentence. He asked questions, his voice gentle and reassuring, and received answers that made him close his eyes briefly as if in pain. When he finally turned back to Chen, his hands were shaking. Her name was Hannah, he translated. She was 8 years old. She'd been in the barn for 3 days, not 2 months. She'd been running away from bad people who'd brought her here in a van. She'd hidden in the barn because it seemed safe. She'd fallen asleep in the hayloft, and when she woke up everything was falling and she couldn't get out. She was very thirsty. Her legs hurt. She was scared of the dark. And she wanted to go home to her mother and soul. The implications of Min-Jun's translation hit everyone within earshot like a physical blow. This wasn't a lost child or a runaway. This was a victim of human trafficking. The bad people she'd mentioned weren't figments of a child's imagination. They were real, and they were criminals who'd brought her to rural Kentucky for purposes that didn't bear thinking about. And somewhere out there, they might be looking for their lost merchandise. Sheriff Coleman's face went hard as granite. He immediately called for additional state police support and notified the FBI field office in Louisville. This was now a federal case. Human trafficking, especially involving a minor, fell squarely under federal jurisdiction. Within the hour, they'd have agents on scene, and within the day there'd be a full investigation launched. But right now, the priority was getting Hannah out alive. Thomas had heard Minjun's translation from his position by the wheelchair. The morphine had worn off enough that the pain was creeping back, setting his nerves on fire, but he barely noticed. His mind was racing, making connections and seeing patterns that others might miss. A trafficked child. Foreign nationals operating in rural areas where law enforcement was sparse. Using isolated properties for transient operations. It fit profiles he'd seen in intelligence briefings during his final years in the army when the focus had shifted from traditional warfare to transnational criminal organizations. His property had been chosen because it was isolated and the owner was dying. Someone had done surveillance, identified him as a soft target. They'd probably planned to use the barn temporarily, move their victim through quickly, and be gone before anyone noticed. But Hannah had escaped. She'd hidden in the barn, and before they could find her, the storm had brought the whole structure down. They'd probably assumed she was dead, buried under tons of debris, and they'd cut their losses and fled. But Atlas had known. Somehow, with that uncanny sense dogs possessed, he'd known there was life in that wreckage. And he'd stood watch, refusing to abandon his post, slowly starving himself to death to protect a child he'd never seen. Thomas reached down and placed his hand on the dog's head. Atlas looked up at him with those amber eyes, and Thomas felt something break open inside his chest. Not his body failing, though that was happening too. Something deeper. Something that had been locked away for so long he'd forgotten it existed. The rescue operation intensified. Chen's team had stabilized the debris field enough to start creating a larger access point. They'd brought in a small excavator that carefully lifted away the bigger pieces of roofing and wall sections. Every movement was calculated, every action monitored by engineers who were constantly assessing the stability of what remained. Park, the confined space paramedic, had managed to get close enough to pass a bottle of water through to Hannah. The sound of her drinking it, desperate and grateful, made several of the hardened first responders turn away to compose themselves. Minjun maintained constant communication with her, his voice a lifeline of comfort in her native language. He told her stories to distract her, asked her about her favorite foods and her favorite games. He learned that she liked drawing, that her favorite color was purple, that she missed her grandmother's cooking. He learned that she'd been taken from a park near her home 3 weeks ago, put on a plane with other children, and brought to America with promises of work and school. The promises had been lies. The FBI arrived with Special Agent Jennifer Walsh leading a team of 3 others. Walsh was a veteran of the Bureau's Crimes Against Children unit, and her face was a mask of controlled fury as she listened to Minjun's translations of Hannah's story. She conferred briefly with Coleman, established jurisdiction, and then focused on the immediate priority: getting the child out safely. The investigation could wait. Justice could wait. Right now, an 8-year-old girl needed rescuing. It took another 3 hours of painstaking work before Chen felt confident they could attempt the extraction. They'd created a stable tunnel through the debris, shored up with hydraulic jacks and wooden cribbing. Park would go in first, assess Hannah's condition, and prepare her for movement. Then they'd slide a rescue basket through, transfer her into it, and bring her out. The window of time where the structure would remain stable was narrow. They'd get one chance. Thomas had been moved back to the porch by Rebecca, who'd finally put her foot down about his exposure to the cold. He was fading visibly, his skin ashen, his breathing labored. She'd given him another dose of morphine, and it had taken the edge off the pain but left him floating in a strange detached state where he could see and hear everything but felt removed from it, like watching a movie of someone else's life. Dorothy sat beside him, holding his hand, her grip tight enough to hurt if he'd been capable of feeling it. Atlas had not left Thomas's side since the rescue operation had intensified. The dog seemed to understand that his part was done, that the humans had taken over, and his job now was to stay with his master. He lay with his head on Thomas's lap, and Thomas's hand rested on his back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. The dog was exhausted, desperately in need of food and water and rest, but he wouldn't leave. Not until Thomas did. Park disappeared into the tunnel they'd created, his body light illuminating the passage. They could hear his voice, calm and professional, talking to Hannah. Min-jun translated his words through a radio link, telling her that the man coming to get her was a doctor, that he was going to help her, that she needed to stay very still and trust him. Park reached her position and began his assessment. Her vital signs were surprisingly good considering her ordeal. She was dehydrated and hypothermic, but her heart rate was strong and her breathing was clear. The beam that had pinned her had actually protected her, creating the void space that had kept her alive. Her left leg was trapped, though. It was wedged beneath a section of the collapsed hayloft floor, and they'd need to lift it to free her. Park carefully explained the plan through Min-jun. They were going to use a special bag to lift the floor just a few inches. It might hurt, but it would only take a few seconds, and then she'd be free. Did she understand? Hannah's small voice came back through the radio. She understood. She was ready. She trusted them. The hydraulic bag was positioned carefully, inflated slowly. The floor section lifted with a groan of stressed wood. Park moved fast, sliding Hannah's leg free, checking for breaks or severe trauma. She cried out once, a sharp sound of pain, but then it was done. She was free. He wrapped her in a thermal blanket, secured her in the rescue basket, and called for extraction. The basket was pulled through the tunnel with agonizing slowness, every inch monitored, every movement controlled. And then she was out, blinking against the daylight, a small figure wrapped in silver insulation looking impossibly fragile. Paramedics swarmed her, starting in 4, checking her vitals, preparing her for transport. Min-jun stayed close, maintaining his translation, keeping her calm. She'd asked for one thing as they brought her out. She wanted to see the dog. The dog who'd stayed with her in the darkness, who'd barked when people came near, who'd lain beside her through the longest night of her life. Agent Walsh looked at Thomas, a question in her eyes. Thomas nodded, and Dorothy wheeled him closer. Atlas rose, his tail wagging slowly, and walked to the gurney where Hannah lay. The little girl's face, so terrified moments before, broke into the first smile anyone had seen from her. She reached out with one small hand, and Atlas gently licked her fingers. She said something in Korean, her voice soft and full of emotion. Min-jun translated, his own voice thick. She says thank you to the brave dog. She says he's a hero. She says she knew someone would come because he promised her they would. Thomas looked down at his dog, at the loyal companion who'd understood what needed to be done and had done it without question or reward. He thought about all the years he'd spent alone, convincing himself that isolation was strength. He thought about all the connections he'd refused to make, all the love he'd pushed away because he believed he didn't deserve it. And he understood, finally, what his life had been missing. It wasn't glory or recognition or the gratitude of strangers. It was this. It was being part of something larger than yourself. It was standing watch over those who couldn't protect themselves. It was refusing to abandon your post even when it cost you everything. Atlas had taught him that. And a small girl named Hannah, who'd survived horrors no child should ever face, had reminded him why it mattered. The ambulance took Hannah away, lights flashing, sirens silent out of deference to her trauma. Agent Walsh had ridden with her, beginning the gentle process of building trust and gathering information. There would be interviews and depositions and a long road to justice. But Hannah was alive. Against all odds, against all logic, she'd survived. And so had Thomas, at least for a few hours more. Rebecca and Dorothy got him back inside the house as the sun reached its zenith and began its descent. The rescue teams were packing up their equipment, documenting the scene, and preparing their after-action reports. Sheriff Coleman stayed behind, sitting on Thomas's porch steps with a cup of the coffee Dorothy had made. He needed to talk to Thomas, to get a formal statement for the investigation. But he also needed to simply be present, to bear witness to what had happened here. Inside, Thomas lay in his hospital bed, propped up on pillows, Atlas curled on the floor beside him exactly where he'd been for months. Rebecca had gotten food and water into the dog, and Atlas had eaten ravenously, his body's desperate need overriding his discipline. Now he slept, his breathing deep and even, his body finally relaxed. He'd completed his mission. He could rest. Thomas was too tired to sleep, too wired on adrenaline and morphine and the strange clarity that came at the very end of things. He stared out the window at his land, at the ruined barn that had held such a terrible secret, at the world he'd be leaving soon. Dorothy sat in the chair beside his bed, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She wasn't talking, wasn't asking questions. She was just there, a steady presence in the gathering darkness. He thought about asking her to call someone, to try to track down his siblings or his ex-wives or someone from his old life. But what would he say? That he was dying and wanted to make peace? That he was sorry for all the ways he'd failed them? The truth was he didn't know how to make those connections anymore. He'd severed them so completely that there was no thread left to follow back. But maybe that was all right. Maybe the family you chose mattered more than the family you were born into. Dorothy had chosen to care for him. Rebecca had chosen to tend to him with dignity and respect. Atlas had chosen to love him with an intensity that transcended species and language. And in his final act, he'd helped save a child who'd had every choice stolen from her. That had to count for something. That had to mean his life, for all its failures and regrets, had mattered in the end. Sheriff Coleman came in just as the room was filling with shadows. He pulled up a chair on the other side of the bed and took out a small notebook. He needed Thomas to walk him through everything from the beginning, he said. When had the barn collapsed? When had Atlas started behaving strangely? Had Thomas seen anyone on his property in the weeks before? Any unusual vehicles, any strangers? Thomas answered each question methodically, his voice growing weaker but his mind still sharp. He told Coleman about his theory, about traffickers using his dying status as cover for their operation. Coleman nodded, writing it all down. The FBI was already working that angle, he said. They'd found tire tracks near the back of the property, evidence of recent vehicle access. They were pulling surveillance footage from the highway cameras, tracking known trafficking routes. Hannah's rescue was just the beginning. There were others out there, other children in the network. And now they had a witness, a survivor who could help them dismantle the entire operation. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas. He'd spent his whole career fighting enemies overseas, protecting American interests in foreign lands. And here at the end, on his own property, he'd struck a blow against an enemy that operated in the shadows right here at home. His last mission hadn't been planned or sanctioned or officially recognized. It had been an accident of timing and circumstance and the fierce loyalty of a dog who refused to quit. Coleman finished his questions and closed his notebook. He looked at Thomas for a long moment, and there was deep respect in his eyes. He'd been wrong about him, he admitted. The whole town had been. They'd seen a recluse, someone who didn't fit in, someone to be wary of. They hadn't seen a soldier who was still fighting, still standing watch, still protecting others even as his own body betrayed him. Thomas managed a weak smile. He'd been wrong too, he said. He thought isolation made him strong. He thought needing no one was a virtue. But watching his dog nearly die to save a stranger had taught him something. Strength wasn't about standing alone. It was about standing for something that mattered more than yourself. Coleman reached out and shook Thomas's hand, a firm grip that conveyed everything words couldn't. Then he left, taking his statement and his newfound understanding with him. Dorothy followed him out to the porch, and Thomas could hear their voices, low and serious. She was asking about Hannah, about what would happen to her now. Coleman was explaining the process. She'd be placed in protective custody, evaluated by specialists, eventually reunited with her family if that was possible and safe. When Dorothy came back inside, her eyes were red but her voice was steady. She'd made a decision, she announced. She was going to stay here tonight. Rebecca needed to go home to her own family, but Thomas shouldn't be alone. She'd sleep in the recliner, keep watch, make sure he was comfortable. He started to protest, to say it wasn't necessary, but she cut him off with a look that brooked no argument. It was happening. He could accept it gracefully or make a fuss, but either way she was staying. Rebecca prepared to leave with obvious reluctance. She gave Dorothy detailed instructions about the morphine pump, about what signs to watch for, about when to call. She gave Thomas a long look, and he could see the knowledge in her eyes. He was close now. Maybe hours, maybe a day. His body was shutting down, conserving what little energy remained for the essential functions. The end, when it came, would likely be peaceful. A gradual fading rather than a dramatic exit. After Rebecca left, the house settled into a comfortable quiet. Dorothy made tea neither of them would drink and turned on a small lamp that cast a warm glow without being harsh. She settled into the recliner with a book, her reading glasses perched on her nose, content to simply be present. Atlas stirred, lifted his head, and looked at Thomas with those knowing amber eyes. The dog rose stiffly, his muscles sore from his ordeal, and did something he'd never done before. He jumped up onto the hospital bed, carefully positioning himself alongside Thomas's body, his head resting on Thomas's chest. Dorothy started to object, to say the bed wasn't meant for that, but Thomas raised one trembling hand to stop her. It was fine. It was more than fine. It was exactly what he needed. He wrapped his arm around his dog, feeling the warmth and solid reality of him, and felt tears slip down his face. Not tears of pain or regret, though there was plenty of both. Tears of gratitude. For this dog who'd loved him without condition. For this woman who'd chosen to care for a dying stranger. For the chance to help save one small life in a world that had taken so many. Atlas shifted slightly, settling more comfortably, and Thomas felt the dog's heartbeat against his ribs. Strong and steady and alive. They'd both survived their final mission. They'd both done their duty. And now, as the darkness gathered outside and the night stretched ahead, they could finally rest. Together, the way it was always meant to be. Thomas woke to sunlight streaming through the window, warm and golden, painting everything in shades of amber that reminded him of Atlas's eyes. For a moment he felt no pain, no weight in his chest, no fire in his bones. He felt light, almost weightless, as if he might float up from the bed and drift through the ceiling into that perfect autumn sky. Then reality reasserted itself with the familiar ache, and he remembered where he was and why. Dorothy was still in the recliner, her book fallen open across her lap, her head tilted at an angle that would leave her neck stiff when she woke. The morning light touched her silver hair and the lines of her face with the same gentle kindness it showed everything else. She'd kept watch through the night, this woman who owed him nothing, who'd chosen to give him the gift of presence when he'd spent his whole life pushing people away. Atlas was still on the bed, a warm solid presence against his side. The dog's breathing was slow and even, deep sleep after days of exhaustion and vigilance. Thomas's hand rested on his back, feeling the rise and fall of his ribs, the steady proof of life. They'd both made it through the night. They'd both survived to see one more dawn. The phone rang, shrill and intrusive in the quiet room. Dorothy startled awake, blinking in confusion before orienting herself. She reached for the cordless phone on the side table, her voice rough with sleep as she answered. Thomas watched her face change as she listened, saw something like wonder replace the grogginess. She held the phone out to him, and he took it with a trembling hand. It was Agent Walsh from the FBI. She was calling with an update, she said, her voice warm despite the early hour. Hannah was stable and recovering at the Children's Hospital in Louisville. She'd been examined by pediatric specialists, treated for dehydration and minor injuries, and was now resting comfortably. More importantly, she'd given them information that had already led to 3 arrests. The trafficking network that had brought her to Kentucky was being dismantled piece by piece, and it was all because Thomas's property had been part of their route. Walsh's voice grew softer. Hannah had asked about him, she said. The little girl wanted to know if the sick man and his brave dog were okay. She'd drawn a picture for them, a child's crayon rendering of a dog with a police badge standing guard over a barn. The hospital staff had promised to mail it, but Walsh wanted Thomas to know right away. That little girl understood what his dog had done for her. She understood that she was alive because Atlas had refused to give up. Thomas's throat tightened until he couldn't speak. He managed a rough thank you before handing the phone back to Dorothy. She finished the conversation, asking practical questions about Hannah's future, about whether she'd be able to go home to Korea, about the legal proceedings ahead. Walsh assured her that everything possible was being done to reunite Hannah with her family and to ensure she received the support and counseling she'd need. The child was resilient, Walsh said. She'd survived something that would have broken many adults. With the right care, she'd heal. After Dorothy hung up, she looked at Thomas with tears in her eyes. He'd saved that child's life, she said. Him and Atlas both. They were heroes, whether they wanted to accept that word or not. Thomas shook his head weakly. He hadn't done anything, he protested. He'd just been dying in his bed while his dog did all the work. Dorothy leaned forward, her voice fierce with conviction. He'd given Atlas a home when no one else would take him. He'd trained him with patience and love. He'd created the bond that made the dog willing to sacrifice everything to protect an innocent life. And when the moment came, when it would have been easier to ignore the problem and let someone else deal with it, he'd insisted on being there. He'd used the last of his strength to make sure that child was saved. That was heroism. That was what mattered. The days that followed took on a strange dreamlike quality. Thomas's body was shutting down by degrees, the cancer claiming territory organ by organ, but his mind remained surprisingly clear. The morphine kept the worst of the pain at bay, and Dorothy's presence kept the loneliness from crushing him. She'd essentially moved into his house, sleeping in the recliner or sometimes on the couch, making sure he was never alone for more than a few minutes at a time. Rebecca came twice a day now instead of 3 times a week, monitoring his decline with professional compassion. She knew the signs, knew exactly what each new symptom meant in terms of timeline. Days, she told Dorothy quietly when she thought Thomas was asleep. 3 or 4 days at most. His kidneys were failing, his liver was shutting down, and his heart was working overtime to keep blood flowing to his brain. The end would come gently when it came, a gradual dimming rather than a sudden darkness. Sheriff Coleman visited on the 3rd day, bringing news that felt surreal in its positivity. The FBI's investigation had expanded dramatically based on Hannah's testimony. They'd identified a network that had trafficked dozens of children over the past 2 years, using rural properties across 3 states as waypoints. Thomas's barn had been one stop in a much larger operation, and its collapse had inadvertently saved not just Hannah but potentially many others. The entire organization was being taken apart, arrests happening from California to Virginia. Coleman also brought something else. A letter from the governor's office, hand-delivered by a state trooper that morning. Thomas was being formally recognized for his role in Hannah's rescue and the broader trafficking investigation. The governor wanted to present him with a commendation, and there was talk of a ceremony if Thomas felt up to it. Coleman looked embarrassed as he read the formal language aloud, clearly uncomfortable with the pomp and circumstance. Thomas listened with a faint smile. The old him would have refused outright, would have seen any recognition as unwanted attention from a system he no longer trusted. But something had shifted in these final days. He understood now that accepting recognition wasn't about ego or pride. It was about acknowledging that what happened mattered, that Hannah's life had value, that standing watch over the vulnerable was worthy of respect. He told Coleman to thank the governor but explained that he wouldn't be well enough for a ceremony. A letter would be sufficient. More than sufficient. What he didn't say was that he had all the recognition he needed. He had Dorothy's fierce loyalty and Rebecca's gentle care. He had the memory of Hannah's small hand reaching out to touch Atlas, her face transformed by gratitude and relief. He had his dog's warm weight beside him every night, proof that love didn't require words or grand gestures. It just required showing up, staying present, and refusing to abandon those who needed you most. Atlas had recovered remarkably in the days since the rescue. Regular meals had restored his strength, and his coat was regaining its luster. But he seemed to understand that Thomas's recovery wasn't possible. The dog was gentle in a way he'd never been before, careful not to jostle or press too hard, as if he knew his master's body was fragile as old paper. He rarely left the bedside except when Dorothy insisted he go outside for brief walks, and even then he hurried back, anxious to resume his post. On the 4th day after the rescue, Thomas woke to find his room full of flowers. Dorothy had been accepting deliveries all morning from people in town who'd heard what happened. There were arrangements from the fire department, from the sheriff's office, from the mayor's office. There were handmade cards from the elementary school where Hannah would have been held if the traffickers' plans had succeeded. There was even a massive bouquet from Bob Henderson at the hardware store, the card apologizing for past judgments and thanking Thomas for his service both to his country and to their community. The outpouring was overwhelming. Thomas had lived among these people for years as a ghost, a shadow they avoided and whispered about. Now, in his final days, they were reaching out with warmth he'd never allowed himself to receive. Part of him wanted to reject it as too little too late, but a wiser part understood that grace meant accepting apologies even when they came at the 11th hour. People were flawed and fearful and quick to judge what they didn't understand. But they were also capable of change, of recognizing their mistakes, of choosing compassion over contempt. That afternoon, Dorothy helped him into his wheelchair one last time. She'd cleaned him up, changed his clothes, and made him as comfortable as possible for what they both knew would be his final trip outside. Kevin arrived with his truck to help maneuver the wheelchair down the ramp and across the yard. Thomas wanted to see the barn one more time, wanted to bear witness to the place that had held such suffering and such salvation. They wheeled him as close as safety permitted. The rescue team had cleared most of the dangerous debris, and what remained was being carefully documented by the FBI as evidence. The old structure was truly gone now, reduced to manageable pieces that would be hauled away in the coming weeks. But standing there in the autumn sunlight, Thomas could see beyond the wreckage to what it had been. A proud building that had served its purpose for generations. A shelter that had protected what mattered. A place where life had been preserved against impossible odds. Atlas walked beside the wheelchair, his posture alert but calm. He sniffed at the debris pile without apparent distress, as if satisfied that his work there was complete. Thomas reached down and scratched behind his ears, and the dog leaned into the touch with obvious contentment. They'd been soldiers together, Thomas thought. They'd stood their watch and held their ground and protected the innocent. There was honor in that, regardless of how much time they'd had to do it. Dorothy took a photo with her phone, capturing Thomas in his wheelchair with Atlas beside him and the autumn trees blazing gold and crimson in the background. She didn't ask permission, just took it, and Thomas was glad. Let there be a record of this moment, this strange peace he'd found at the very end. Let there be proof that a dying man and his loyal dog had mattered in the grand scheme of things. That night, back in his bed with Atlas curled beside him and Dorothy keeping watch, Thomas felt the change. It was subtle at first, a loosening in his chest, a sense of his body finally surrendering the fight it had been losing for months. He wasn't afraid. The morphine kept him comfortable, and the presence of his companions kept him anchored. He was ready for whatever came next. He thought about Hannah, probably asleep in her hospital bed, guarded by federal agents and healing from wounds both physical and psychological. He thought about the other children who'd been saved because of what happened here, lives reclaimed from darkness. He thought about all the years he'd wasted believing he didn't deserve connection, didn't merit love, wasn't worthy of the sacrifice others made on his behalf. He'd been wrong about so much. Strength didn't mean standing alone against the world. It meant building bonds strong enough to carry you when you couldn't carry yourself. Courage wasn't the absence of fear or need. It was choosing to show up anyway, to be vulnerable anyway, to love anyway despite the certainty of loss. Atlas had taught him that. Dorothy had taught him that. Even Hannah, in her childish gratitude and resilience, had taught him that. His breathing was growing shallower, each inhalation requiring more effort than the last. Dorothy noticed the change and moved to sit on the edge of his bed, taking his hand in both of hers. She didn't speak, didn't offer false comfort about fighting or holding on. She just sat with him, bearing witness, offering presence. Atlas lifted his head and rested it on Thomas's chest, his amber eyes fixed on his master's face. Thomas wanted to say something profound, something that would capture the gratitude and peace and unexpected grace of these final days. But words felt inadequate, too small to hold the enormity of what he felt. So he simply squeezed Dorothy's hand with what little strength remained, and rested his other hand on Atlas's head, and let himself drift. The end came quietly just before dawn, as Rebecca had predicted it would. One moment he was breathing, shallow and slow. The next moment he wasn't, and the struggle that had defined his final year was finally over. Dorothy felt the change immediately, the subtle shift from presence to absence. She sat for a long moment, her hand still holding his, tears streaming silently down her face. Atlas knew too. The dog lifted his head and released a low mournful sound, not quite a howl but close, a lament for the human who'd given him purpose and love. He stayed on the bed for hours after, unwilling to leave even though Dorothy gently tried to coax him away. He was standing watch one last time, guarding his master's body the way he'd guarded the barn, loyal beyond reason, faithful beyond death. The funeral was held 5 days later at the small church in Millbrook. Dorothy had arranged everything with quiet efficiency, reaching out to the few contacts she'd found in Thomas's papers. His siblings sent flowers but didn't attend, claiming distance and prior commitments. His ex-wives sent nothing. But the church was full anyway. Sheriff Coleman came with half his department in dress uniform. Chief Webb brought his entire fire crew. Agent Walsh drove up from Louisville with the prosecutor handling the trafficking case. Min Jun Lee attended, the young interpreter who'd been Hannah's voice during the rescue. Dozens of townspeople who'd never spoken to Thomas while he lived came to pay their respects to the man who'd helped save a child they'd never met. The service was simple. A local pastor who'd visited Thomas once in his final days spoke about sacrifice and redemption, about lives that mattered not for their length but for their impact. Dorothy gave a brief eulogy, her voice steady despite her grief, talking about the quiet dignity of the man she'd befriended, about his loyalty and his courage and his unexpected capacity for love. She didn't mention his mistakes or his failures or the years he'd spent isolated by choice and circumstance. She spoke only of who he'd become in the end. Atlas attended the funeral, his first and last public appearance. Dorothy had insisted, and no one had objected. The dog sat perfectly still throughout the service, his eyes fixed on the flag-draped coffin, his posture one of attention and respect. When they played taps at the graveside, his ears pricked forward as if listening for a command that would never come. 3 weeks later, Dorothy received a package from Korea. Inside was a letter from Hannah's mother, carefully translated into English, expressing gratitude that transcended language barriers. There was a photo of Hannah with her family, her smile genuine and healing visible in her eyes. And there was a drawing, much more sophisticated than the crayon picture from the hospital. It showed a soldier in uniform standing beside a large dog, both of them with wings, watching over a little girl who was running free through a field of flowers. Dorothy framed the drawing and hung it in her living room where she'd see it every day. She'd adopted Atlas after the funeral, unable to bear the thought of the heroic dog going to strangers or worse. He'd settled into her home with surprising ease, as if understanding that this was his new mission, his new watch to stand. He slept by her bed each night, walked with her each morning, and seemed to have found a measure of peace in his new purpose. On the property where the barn had stood, Dorothy planted a garden the following spring. Not flowers or vegetables, but a grove of young oak trees that would grow tall and strong, providing shelter and shade for generations to come. She placed a simple stone marker among the trees with an inscription she'd written herself. Thomas Patterson, veteran and guardian. Atlas, faithful companion. They stood watch when it mattered most. The trafficking network that had brought Hannah to Kentucky was completely dismantled within 6 months. 17 people were arrested and convicted, and 23 children were recovered and reunited with their families. The case became a training example for law enforcement agencies across the country, a reminder that vigilance and persistence could defeat even the most hidden evils. Hannah returned to school in Seoul, where she excelled in art class and told her teachers she wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up. She kept the photo of Atlas on her desk, a reminder that courage could come in unexpected forms, that salvation could arrive wearing fur and loyalty, that heroes were often those the world overlooked. And in the quiet hills of rural Kentucky, where autumn turned to winter turned to spring in its eternal cycle, Dorothy would sometimes stand among the young oak trees and remember. She'd remember a dying man who'd found purpose in his final days. She'd remember a dog who'd refused to abandon his post. She'd remember a little girl who'd survived because two unlikely heroes had been exactly where they needed to be when it mattered most. The story spread through the community and beyond, taking on the qualities of legend. Some details were embellished, others forgotten, but the heart of it remained true. A veteran and his dog had stood watch over the vulnerable, had refused to give up even when giving up would have been easier, had chosen duty over comfort and compassion over convenience. In a world that often felt dark and uncertain, it was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth carrying forward. Because in the end, that was what mattered. Not the length of a life but its impact. Not the ease of a path but the courage to walk it anyway. Not the absence of fear but the presence of love strong enough to overcome it. Thomas and Atlas had taught that lesson without meaning to, had demonstrated it without seeking recognition, had lived it right up until the very end. Their watch was over. But the light they'd guarded continued to shine, carried forward by everyone who'd witnessed their loyalty, their sacrifice, their unwavering commitment to doing what was right even when it cost everything. That light would burn for generations, a beacon in the darkness, a reminder that true heroism was often found in the quietest places, performed by the most unlikely heroes, recognized only after the final watch had ended. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.